All right. So the program this evening, we're going to talk about, see here, the soldiers, monuments, preservation on the lower end of the Antietam Battlefield. We're going to talk about the fighting, remembering, preservation. So, just to get everyone on the same page, what we're talking about, obviously the map of the battlefield, might be able to see the label for the cornfield, the sunken road. Boonesboro Turnpike is kind of our dividing line. We're talking everything south. You heard about the artillery from Jim, the Confederate infantry from Lucas, all south. So we're going to focus on the Burnside Bridge, final attack, monuments, and preservation. South end of the battle. Lucas touched on this a little bit, but typically a visitor's experience at Antietam Battlefield ends after they see the Burnside Bridge. And why is that? Why is that? It's one of the best known landmarks of the American Civil War, so there's a lot of buildup. They get to the visitor center, you see the movie, they hear about the Burnside Bridge. It's later on in the tour. It's tangible. It's not a grove of trees, or a cornfield, or a soybean field, or a fence line. You can walk across the bridge. You can touch the bridge. Is that one of the most probably famous landmarks? There's probably, you can name out there, Fort Sumter, right? Another landmark. One of the most famous is the bridge. Why is it overlooked? Maybe it's just in the end because people have seen 7 other stops in the 95-degree heat and humidity, and they have a carload of family and friends that they're done. They just want to move on. But through the memory, the soldiers, their preservation efforts, and all these working together have allowed us to expand the story and to be able to go out there tomorrow and learn more about what happens after the Union 9th Corps crosses the Antietam Creek. So it's the task of 500 Confederate soldiers from Georgia, very few from South Carolina. They're tasked with defending the lower bridge all the way down to the Snavely Ford. The bridge itself, just to refresh everyone, built in 1836 at a cost of $3,600. 2 major renovations of the bridge, one in the 1950s, and then just recently about 7 years ago. So it's the original bridge, as close as you're going to get to it. Right? 180 feet across, spanning the creek, about 12 feet wide. A couple different names, the Rohrbach Bridge, the lower bridge. James Longstreet called it Bridge Number 3. Most famously, the Burnside Bridge, right? All interchangeable. There we go. All right. As Lucas mentioned, Robert Toombs, his name is always attached with the defense of the bridge. Toombs thinks he's commanding a lot more than he really is. From the bridge down to the Snavely Ford, Toombs is in overall command of that. But right at the bridge specifically, Henry Benning. Henry Benning. Benning never served in the United States Army, but later on he has a base in the United States Army named. The name has changed though. Fort Moore. Probably more appropriate. Between Toombs and Benning, before the war, combined, they owned 3 plantations, over 75 enslaved, and their net worth between the two of them, $10 million in today's money. They're invested in the cause. They're invested. This is a view from the Confederate side looking down to the bridge. This is the road that leads up north, crosses the bridge, and then runs north into Sharpsburg. These are the fields where the Federal assaults will originate from, and behind this line here, back in the distance, the Henry Rohrbach Farm. Union 9th Corps, 12,000 men, they're on the Rohrbach Farm, and that's where the originating points. Jim said, the problem is the space. The space. Where are you going to put 12,000 men? Where are you going to put 24 pieces of artillery? It's a very small, tight area. So you have 500 Confederates. This is from the east side of the creek, the federal side of the creek, looking across to the Confederate defense. Of course, the bridge down here to your left might be a little bit hard to see, but the terrain a little more open back then than it is today. Confederate defenders are in the trees, some of them said. They're using fence lines up there, rock walls. As you drive up to the bridge today, everyone is focused down to your left. As you're driving up the hill, looking down to the bridge, if you look up to the right, there's a rock wall there. That rock wall, used by the Confederate defenders. So what I tried to do, just to point those out a little bit, in the circle on the right, the stone wall up there. Up in the middle, up in the shadows here, you can see rail fences running across. Over here, trees down. So the Confederates are using the terrain to their advantage. There's a large quarry pit scooped out. 25 to 30 Confederates in that quarry pit. This is a view from the quarry pit looking down towards the bridge. You have the Confederate side looking down towards the bridge. It is an excellent defensive position. Robert Toombs wrote, its chief strength lay in the fact that from the nature of the ground on the other side, the enemy were compelled to approach mainly by the road, which led up to the river for nearly 300 paces, parallel with my line of battle, and it was distant only 50 to 100 feet. It exposed the Federal flank to a destructive fire at almost the entire distance. It's a strong, strong position. I do know the story. I just have my sheets here to keep me in line. so that these guys don't rustle me to the ground after all. So the Union assaults to carry the bridge. Because of the short time, we're not going to get into the details of what time did the order get down for Burnside to take the bridge. Was the order going to Burnside or was it going to Jacob Cox? Why didn't the Federals just run across the creek? We talk about that later. I'm not going to answer that now. I'm going to jump right into it. The assault gets underway right about 9:30, give or take, right about 9:30. Just something to point out, that's also the same time the Federal forces are attacking the sunken road. So the idea of piecemeal assaults, something to think about. The Union 2nd Corps, 15,000 men, and the 12th Corps, 12,000 men, 27,000 Federal soldiers are moving forward at some point on the battlefield. But the first soldiers to move towards the bridge, this is a little bit later on, let's see where they are. First soldiers to move towards the bridge, the 11th Connecticut. You heard about the soldiers from Connecticut a little bit earlier from John. The 11th Connecticut is sent forward. They're going to provide the covering fire for the main assaults that are going to unfold. Again, because of the space issues, 2 companies are sent forward south of the bridge. So in this photo, to the right of the bridge is the road that leads into and towards the bridge, rail fence. 2 companies from the 11th Connecticut are ordered to get behind the fence. They're going to provide the covering fire for the main assaults that are going to unfold. As they're making their way from the Rohrbach farm to the bridge towards that fence line, Confederates start firing towards them. The colonel of the 11th Connecticut, Henry Kingsbury, mortally wounded on the spot where the monument stands today for the 11th Connecticut. Mortally wounded. And the soldiers wrote, after Kingsbury was lost, the hope of the regiment was gone. The men in the regiment will cut up his boots and save the leather as souvenirs. But along the fence, the 2 companies, John Griswold, one of the captains down there, he and his men don't like being pinned down. They jump over the fence down into the creek to try and get across, and very quickly, 50 out of 100 are killed or wounded. Griswold also mortally wounded, taken across the Confederate side and back towards the Henry Rohrbach farm. So those soldiers are not providing the covering fire for the main assaults that are about to unfold. And these attacks are one right after another, one right after another. The first main assault, soldiers from Ohio. George Crook commanding, a national hero before the Civil War. Fighting the Indians in the 1850s, he's wounded in the hip by an arrow. And when the orders get to Crook, go take the bridge, he asks the messenger, where's the bridge? And the messenger says, it's in that direction. And he turns around and rides off. That kind of explains what's going on down at the bridge. Very little communication. Two regiments, 28th Ohio and the 11th Ohio, start making their way to the bridge. The 28th gets lost in the high ground and the trees up there. The regiment is split. Part of the regiment is pulled down about 300 yards from the bridge. Confederate defensive line, some skirmishers north of the bridge. That fire draws part of this regiment. The 11th Ohio, they rush the mouth of the bridge. And how do you think that turns out? 300 men rushing the mouth of a 12-foot wide bridge. Driven back. Right on the heels of Crook and those Ohioans, James Nagel's brigade, they've already seen the 11th Connecticut go towards the fence and towards the creek. That didn't work out. The 11th Ohio, they're stuck at the bridge. So the idea then, the next assault, they're going to punch a hole in the fence 200 yards downstream, run up the road, and charge across the bridge in that fashion. Their column 4 by 4 by 4. But as Toombs said, as they do that, they're presenting the flank to the Confederates, and they're easily able to fire down. The 2nd Maryland, Jacob Duryea leading them, they get to within about 200 feet of the bridge, and they're pinned down. The 6th New Hampshire, they don't even get out into the road. They're pinned down, and Nagel's brigade can't take the bridge. 3rd assault, one knows the story, the 251st, the 51st Pennsylvania, 51st New York. And their assault will begin opposite the bridge in the high ground. And they'll slide down the high ground on their backsides. And as they're doing that, the two commanders get together and they determine it's not going to be wise for 700 men to rush the mouth of a 12-foot wide bridge. So the Pennsylvanians, they're sent north of the bridge, behind the stone wall. New Yorkers, they're sent south of the bridge, behind the rail fence. Stone wall, rail fence, where do you want to be on September 7th? You want to be from Pennsylvania. This photo here depicts the point when the federal forces from Pennsylvania and New York carrying the bridge. William Bolton from the 51st, he remembered. The regiment received volley after volley of grape musketry, shot and shell, filling our faces and eyes with sand and dirt. All this time we were reserving our fire. The order to charge was given by heart ramp, certain death, as if it were staring us in the face. We made a dash for the bridge through a perfect hell of shot and shell, and within a few feet of the bridge, a mini ball came crashing through my right lower jawbone, carrying away all the teeth on the right side of my face. The ball passed through my mouth and came out the other side of my face, about a quarter of an inch below my ear. Finding myself wounded and speechless, he said, I attempted to go to the rear, but had not proceeded far when from the loss of blood I fainted and fell to the ground. I was finally found by members of my own company, placed in a blanket, and carried to the rear, where just a few moments before I had left with a bad case of a toothache, but I lost it in the battle and I've never had it since. He's taken to the Locust Spring Hospital, survives his wound, back in the Army, wounded in the neck at the crater. Survives that. He goes home, opens up a wallpaper store. A little bit slow pace. One step up from watching paint dry, right? Wallpaper store. So, while working at the story goes that he was helping someone, he starts coughing fit, coughs out the chunk of metal lodged in his neck. But there's William Bolton. But at any rate, 700 federal soldiers in a close formation at the bridge. Confederates are not instructed to hold the bridge till the last man, just stay down there as long as they could hold out. Eventually they start to run low on ammunition, the fire starts to drop off. The New Yorkers, they'll claim they charge across the bridge, the color bearers will charge across first. The Pennsylvanians see the colors going across the bridge, and they're like, we're not going to let the New Yorkers have the honor of carrying the bridge, so 4 battle flags at once stream across the bridge. Soldiers follow. The bridge is carried. 600 casualties in the fight for the bridge, about 500 on the federal side, about 120 on the Confederate side. bridge is taken about 12:30, give or take. It's about the same time the sunken road falls. Almost the entire Ninth Corps crosses at the bridge, except for about 3,000 men commanded by Isaac Rodman. They'll cross at the Snavely Ford. But they will form up in the high ground on the western side of the Antietam Creek. It took about 2.5 hours to get 10,000 men across the narrow bridge to get them reformed and resupplied. So there's a delay, but it's a necessary delay. With the bridge is about the window right here. How long is it going to take to jam 10,000 through that window and then deploy back out? It's going to take a while. So the armchair historians that visit the battlefield or go on the tours with you guys, Burnside was an idiot. If he would have moved quicker, the battle would have been more of a resounding Union victory. A lot easier said than done. Now we've moved from the bridge. This is good. It shows a Henry Rohrbach farm, so it's in this area where the Ninth Corps starts up. Here's the bridge. They have crossed. The blue boxes, not exactly specific brigades or regiments. They're just illustrating where the Federal soldiers are forming up. Middle bridge here. Long-range Federal artillery that Jim spoke of. Guys, Lucas, D.R. Jones has been, Tom Sharp. Ford is just off the map, down the bottom here. Now the battle, so back on time.
We got all night.
The battle's not fought in open fields in the middle of nowhere. It's fought in the backyard of a pretty significant sized community. The 1860 census, the town of Sharpsburg, 1,200 people. Surprisingly, there are no civilian casualties on the day of the battle. But in the days after, you can imagine the impact of 100,000 soldiers coming into a community. Tens and thousands of horses and mules. Two families down here that you guys will walk past tomorrow if you go on the excursions. You'll hear Kevin and Jim talk about them, the Sherrick and the Otto family. Sherrick family. Joseph Sherrick wasn't at his house. He was leasing that out. Leonard Emmerich was a tenant farmer. After the battle, he was removed from the house, displaced for about a month. Federal Army's using the house as a field hospital. As the armies were moving into town, Joseph Sherrick will take his $3,000 and hide it in the rock walls surrounding his farm. When you're out there tomorrow, don't go looking for his gold. He came back and he found it. $3,000 in 1862, $88,000 today. Would you go hide your $88,000 in your fence? You go on vacation? Oh, maybe you would. In his claim to the government, Sherrick said he lost 30 jars of fruit, 25 glasses of preserve, 50 pounds of sugar, and 200 pounds of bacon. A U.S. soldier wrote after the battle when they went to the house, "What a feast! No crowd of schoolboys ever acted so absurd." The Otto farm. John Otto will take his family from this map down to the corner, down Miller's Sawmill Road, halfway between the Potomac River and the high ground on the battlefield. Hillary Watson, enslaved by the Ottos, he is sent back to the house to make sure it's locked up. When he gets there, he sees a window's broken. Inside, he finds a Confederate, confronted by Confederate soldiers. Certainly a tense standoff. Hillary said that somehow scared the Confederate away. The Confederate took off. Henry was not taken with him, wasn't shot. He survives that. They were forced out of their home for 7 weeks as the Army of the Potomac used it as a field hospital. In their claim to the government, Otto said he had just delivered his rye harvest to the grain mill, and he was going to pick it up later in September. When he went to go pick it up, found that it was gone. It was taken by the Army to feed the horses. He lost 13 cords of seasoned firewood, which was used for fuel in the hospitals. And 100 bushels of old corn for the horses as well, old corn from the previous year. But again, the community is certainly affected. The Roulette family. Mr. Roulette said he had 700 bodies buried in his fields. He lives just north of the sunken road. His young daughter, Carrie Mae, died 2 months after the battle from disease brought in by these armies. So the battle certainly affects this community. But sizing up the forces down here, you have roughly 8,000 Union soldiers formed up. Jim mentioned 24 artillery pieces, give or take. On the Confederate side, D.R. Jones, 6 brigades, starting just on the north end of Route 34, the Boonesboro Turnpike. You have Garnett's brigade, Jenkins' brigade, Drayton and Kemper on the south end, Shank Evans and his men, and Robert Toombs. Not more, as Lucas mentioned, not more than 3,500 soldiers. As far as artillery, up on the high ground, depending on what time you're talking about, as Jim said, between 40 to 60 pieces of Confederate artillery, pointing down towards the Federal soldiers. Just a couple photos here showing the open, again, back to the open terrain that these guys spoke of earlier. You're not going to see this openness today, but this image is looking kind of southeast. As you're driving the battlefield, you're coming to the Sherrick House, which is the house right here. Auto farm and barn, which no longer stands, but you can see the open terrain across the top. And it's just beyond that ridge where the Federal forces are forming up. This view looking up towards the National Cemetery, this white, very distinct line, is the National Cemetery, wall around the cemetery. So again, the Sherrick barn, we're looking northwest, Burnside Ridge directly behind you. Sherrick barn, Sherrick house down in here, the auto farm in here, and a collection of buildings. You have a collection of the auto farm and the old mill, the Lum Mill. You're going to see that tomorrow for those going on the excursion. But again, the open terrain, the open terrain. Artillery on that high ridge pointing towards us. So the assault on the south end of the field, the terrain plays as much of a role in stopping the Union assault as the Confederate defenders on the high ground. And you're going to experience that tomorrow. Jim mentioned the land is just up and down, up and down. It's a climb, or in some places even looks very similar. Lucas had the photo of pointing across the kind of the level terrain out to the 9th New York Monument, but the land drops off up and down. And every time the Federal soldiers, as they advance, get to the ridge line, they're pounded by this artillery. And then they'll move down into the low ground, and that's where they'll reform. But the openness of the terrain, that is 162 years ago, not what you're going to see today. Okay. The Union battle line was a mile in length. Going back to this photo here. About right here, the 9th Corps line ends. It stretches all the way down to the lower cornfield. The 16th Connecticut down here. So it's a mile-long battle line. It did connect with the Union 5th Corps, the U.S. Regulars, so there was a connection there. Battle line is a mile long. It's a little interesting also that Antietam always is kind of second place to Gettysburg. You don't even say Gettysburg at these meetings. No, we don't. It is interesting, though, that you have a frontal assault uphill, and on the high ground here, you have Kemper, Garnett, when about 9 months later, the roles are reversed. 8,000 Federal soldiers. Gettysburg, again, they're number one. They have 12,000 soldiers. Pickett's charge. There's only 8,000 in Antietam. But at any rate, interesting comparison kind of between those two battlefields that everyone's familiar with. There are 4 Federal brigades: Christ, Welsh, Fairchild, and Harlan. Again, it's 8,000 men. And the assault is kind of a stepped attack. It starts here with these guys pushing out, and then these guys here, when they see this line moving, they'll start to move, and then they'll start to move, and they'll start to move. In echelon, right? Heard that before. Just as the Federal soldiers get to the very end of the Confederate line, it's at that point the last group of Confederate troops arrive in the field from Harper's Ferry, 3,000 men commanded by A.P. Hill. 3,000 start, only about 1,200 make it. Lucas spoke about the straggling. Robert E. Lee wrote, just to expand on that, the worst time he encountered straggling during the Civil War was during the Maryland campaign. During the Maryland campaign. I think Joe Harsh puts the number of Confederates crossing at right around 65 or 70,000 into Maryland on the 4th of September. By the time they get to Antietam, it's about 40,000. And just as the Federal soldiers get to the end of the Confederate line, it's at that point Hill arrives, slams into the flank, drives Union soldiers back down towards the Antietam Creek. There's a smaller assault by some soldiers from Ohio. George Crook, or excuse me, this is Ewing's brigade, the 23rd Ohio and the 30th Ohio. They'll rush down into the lower cornfield and stop the Confederate assault coming off of the high ground in Harper's Ferry Road. Sun starting to set on the battlefield, the fighting slowly fades away. On the south end of the field, there is a little bit of fighting. I don't want to say fighting, but there's certainly some skirmishing or shots being taken on the 18th. Up on the north end, everything's pretty quiet, a lot of informal truces. But on the south end, the temperature is still pretty hot. Feelings are still strong, and there is some firing back and forth on the 18th. As we know, in the evening of the 18th, Lee will fall back from Maryland into Virginia. And in wrapping up the story on the south end, as far as the U.S. side, the highest number of casualties for a brigade on the Union side on the Antietam battlefield. There are many hard-fighting brigades on the battlefield. On the north end, John Gibbon, later known as the Iron Brigade, right? Gibbon, 34% casualty rate in his brigade. A little east of him in the morning of the battle, George Hartsuff and his men from Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania. 47% in that brigade. Going into the West Woods, Gorman's brigade, the first line into the West Woods, 41% casualty rate. At the Sunken Road, Thomas Marr and the Irish Brigade, 40%. The highest percent for a Union brigade, Harrison Fairchild on the south end of the battlefield. 49%. Loses 454 out of 940. That is the 9th New York, which we'll hear about on Saturday evening from Jim. It's a great story. He has a great presentation. You will like that tomorrow evening. The 9th New York, the 89th, and the 103rd. Those three regiments. 48%. As far as on the Confederate side, just a little bit. The Texas Brigade, 56% casualty rate in the cornfield. And Harry Hayes, who fought against Hartsuff, Harry Hayes, 60% casualty rate. Now it is not quite 20 years before the first monument is placed on the Antietam battlefield. This is a little bit from the fighting to the monument placing. First monument on the battlefield is that one right there, Old Simon, the private soldier monument in the National Cemetery. Behind him, again, notice all the open fields. Open fields. And it's back here where the Federal assaults formed up from, and they moved across this ground in this direction. But the monument, 1880. 1880. First monument on the battlefield. It is not until 25 years after the battle, first monument is placed outside of the National Cemetery. Gettysburg, or I should say Antietam, different than the other battlefields. I'll get into that in just a little bit. But you have the private soldier monument in the cemetery, and then there are two monuments from regiments that fought on the battlefield. The 4th New York fought at the Sunken Road. Their monument is in the National Cemetery. The 20th New York, they'll put a monument in the cemetery as well. They fought by the Dunkard Church. They put the monuments there because that's where land was owned, and they didn't have to deal with the local people to procure land. So the land in the cemetery, it's free land to place a monument. So those three monuments are placed initially. First monument on the battlefield on the south end, on any part of the battlefield, is on the southeastern part of the Burnside Bridge, is right here. Right on the corner of the bridge. Monument to the 51st Pennsylvania. Next monument, A couple years later, 1894. 1894. There we go. Oh, just another photo of the bridge here. You can see the monument, better photo of the monument on the corner of the bridge. And so in the end, 4 regiments will place monuments on each corner of the bridge. This is from the Union side looking up towards the Confederate side. And a little bit of foreshadowing. You can maybe see a little building in the trees here. And there are a couple buildings up in the high left corner. This photo is 25 years after the battle. There's some houses up there already. But anyway, the first monument is that one right there, 51st Pennsylvania. 1894, the 35th Massachusetts placed their monument on the corner of the bridge, stack of cannonballs. 1898, 21st Massachusetts, they'll place their monument on this end of the bridge. See that little mini ball? And then in 1900, the state of Maryland will place monuments. The 2nd Maryland, right there. As far as down at the bridge, in 1908, the 51st New York will place their monument just to the right of this image. So those are the initial monuments down in that area of the battlefield. Traffic will travel over that road. You could drive your car across the bridge until 1964. Because there was so much traffic going over, moving ahead a little bit, a bypass is built. But at any rate, just keep this in mind. These monuments are getting hit by cars and trucks. I say 1964, what do the cars in 1964 look like? Pretty low, but they're big. But they're not high enough to hit these monuments. But you go back in time, this roof line, clipping the monuments. The first state, those are the 4 monuments on the corner of the bridge, just to refresh everyone's mind if you're not familiar with it. So the first one again, the drum, the second one on the far left, the third, the bullet, and the Maryland Monument, 2nd Maryland right there. So they were removed from the bridge a little bit later on. The first state to get their act together and combine monuments for regiments, the Connecticut guys. I stole that from you.
It looks familiar.
It looks familiar.
Right?
Yeah.
That's totally cool.
That's what we're doing.
Yeah,
that's what we do.
absolutely.
So, Connecticut is the first state to get their act together. They will give each regiment $1,000 to place monuments on the battlefield. And it was a veterans reunion at Antietam where the guys get together and say, hey, let's put some monuments out here. So they decide that they're going to do that in October of 1894. Huge event in Sharpsburg. 400 veterans from Connecticut will arrive to dedicate their monuments. The 16th Connecticut will procure land in the lower cornfield, 10 acres of land, where they fought, and that's where they're going to place their monument. The 11th Connecticut, they're also going to place their monument in that same group, or that same piece of land, that same plot, if you will. The 14th Connecticut will place their monument. They'll get some land from a landowner north of the sunken road. It's one of the first monuments north of the Boonesboro Turnpike. 14th Connecticut. The 8th Connecticut will get some land up on the high ground where they made their final assault. But originally, the 11th Connecticut is in this field, in the lower cornfield. When the War Department is in charge of the battlefield, George W. Davis is one of the guys that is running the show. He fought in the 11th Connecticut. And he says, well, that monument's in the wrong place. And so a year after the monument is dedicated and placed in this lower cornfield, they will move the monument to its present-day location down by the bridge. That's where they fought. So that's why the monument is moved there. But this photo, very interesting because it is a photo when it's in its original position. Its original position. When the guys from Connecticut come out in October of 1894, they're great friends with the town of Sharpsburg. John showed us the photo of the stained glass window they bought at the Reformed Church. They also provided the church a hymn book in order of the pulpit. Great friends. They'll travel back to Connecticut. Fella in Sharpsburg will send to his friends in Connecticut 2 possums that he trapped. I don't have any answers. Maybe John has the answers for the possums. What happened to the possums? Were they in cages when they went there? I don't know. We don't know. Who knows? Yep. But at any rate, it's a thought that counts. Exactly. There you go. 1897, so just 3 years after the Connecticut monuments are placed in the battlefield, Rush Hawkins will place a monument on the high ground for the 9th New York. The 9th New York. Part of the brigade that suffered the highest number of casualties, percentage-wise. The 9th New York, almost 50% in that regiment alone. About 140 out of 340. Something along those lines. The members of the regiment wrote of how they appreciated Ezra Carmen. Carmen was the first historical expert at Antietam, and at the time the monument is placed, he's assisting the War Department, and he's assisting the veterans when they come back to procure land from the local farm owners. After the day of the monument dedication, after the dedication is over, the veterans will call Carmen over, and they'll give him a silver drinking cup to show their appreciation. Back to the town of Sharpsburg and the possums a little bit. Carmen wrote, again, he's very helpful in the vets dealing with the landowners, but Carmen said that the folks in Sharpsburg, they were a bit unsophisticated. He said he did hire a good laborer, though. He was a Union soldier wounded at Gettysburg and a Democrat, and not a whiskey guzzler, which was a rare item in this area. Next state, place their monuments on the field, Ohio. It's really the catalyst of the assassination of William McKinley in 1901. Ohio says we need to place monuments on the Antietam Battlefield. McKinley Monument is placed. October of 1903, it is not September because New Jersey is also placing monuments. In September of 1903, President Roosevelt is there. And Ohio says, well, we're not going to deal with that. We'll come back in October. Everybody knows October is a better time to visit Antietam anyways. Leaves are changing, temperature's down a little bit, October's better. So the guys from the Buckeye State made a good choice. October, they will dedicate their monuments. Next year, the Pennsylvanians will come back. They'll dedicate monuments in 1904. Pennsylvania, unusual because they're honoring regiments that don't have monuments at Gettysburg already. Maybe an afterthought. And the Pennsylvania monuments, you'll notice as you go around the battlefield, if you haven't already, are all very similar. Both of these from Pennsylvania look pretty similar. The base, the plaque, with kind of the order of battle all the battles they were engaged in. A soldier on top. So the Pennsylvania monuments are all very similar. There was a discussion of putting a Pennsylvania state monument at Antietam. Never really got off the ground, as we know that didn't happen. As far as the south end of the battlefield, that's kind of the way the monuments were placed. Can you guess which state those are from?
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania, yeah. Everyone's not asleep. But again, the same design. Same design. All right, now moving to the preserving part. This is a photo of the lower bridge area. The blue, obviously, the Antietam Creek. North is going to be at the top, so this is the way everything should be. The bridge right here. Here's the road that leads from south of town up across the bridge and then into Sharpsburg. Because of the stress and strain that these local families encounter after the battle, they need to start making money. They need money from somewhere. And so some of them will start selling bits and pieces of their land. And within 2 years after the battle, structures are being placed right around and above the Burnside Bridge, these buildings here. We saw these a little bit earlier. pointed them out a little bit when we were looking across the bridge. The bridge is right here in the center. The farm here, the Spong farm. This is even before the other buildings were built over here. This is very early on, 1864 or 5. This photo is from 1889, but at any rate, very early on. This structure is placed right there, overlooking the creek. You see the old lane down here. But again, I'll point out the open, the terrain back here. Things are changing a little bit, not as open as the earlier photos, right? Again, Henry Rohrbach farm back in this direction. Not a photograph of the McKinley Monument, but the buildings just beyond the monument. Just beyond the monument. Those buildings, just kind of moving ahead a little bit, they are removed in 1946. They're there for a long time, 1946. By that point, the Park Service owns that area, and it is determined, even though they're historic, not historic or important to the Battle of the Antietam, telling of the story. So those buildings all removed, 1846. Jumping ahead, similar map, this is 1966. Park Service is starting to own some land up here. The road, mainly, is the big change. That old road that ran here to here to here, now changed. The bypass is constructed 1966. Same time the traffic is taken off of the Burnside Bridge. Used to be a little parking area right down here. Park your car. Some of you might remember that, right? The bypass is put in, runs across the top, runs around the hill, in between the low ground, between the Rohrbach farm and the area around the bridge. This just demonstrates that road. The Burnside Bridge. Oh, jumping ahead. The Burnside Bridge, not owned by the government until 1945. Up until that point, it's owned by Washington County. In 1933, they were going to donate the bridge to the Park Service. A lot of rules and couldn't accept donations at the time, so it took 8 years for us to be able to accept us, just the Park Service, but us, the American people. It is ours now. So that takes place 1945. The bridge is transferred to the American people. This is again from the Confederate side looking across the stone wall down there where the Pennsylvanians were behind. And of course, the witness tree right there in the center. Monuments were already covering the landscape when the War Department creates Antietam Battlefield. Antietam is one of 5 War Department battlefields created in the 1890s. Antietam, Gettysburg, Shiloh, Chattanooga, Vicksburg, War Department battlefields. Comparing to Gettysburg, right after the battle, the townspeople, everybody is buying up parts of the land to preserve it. There are ads in veterans magazines, come out and procure your parcel of land to place your monument. Very different at Antietam. The War Department is buying up just enough land to put a road through the important parts of the field. So this is 1933, and it is just this little green avenue here. This owned by government. There's the Connecticut plot. Connecticut plot, the road leading up to the Boonesboro Turnpike. That's all the government owned when it's transferred from the War Department to the National Park Service. The first purchase by the War Department was along the Sunken Road. That was the first piece of land bought by the government from the locals. All of the War Department land or roads are the avenues. Mansfield Avenue, named for the generals that were mortally wounded. Mansfield Avenue, Stark Avenue, Richardson Avenue, the first one along the Sunken Road. On the south end, Rodman Avenue was the first part acquired from the Sherrick Farmhouse up to the Boonesboro Turnpike. That section was the first section in the south end, bought up by the War Department. A little bit later that year, 1895, this junction right here. It's about 2 acres of land, but it's kind of where these roads intersect. So that is acquired. A little bit later in the year, Branch Avenue, this L, the reverse L shaped piece of land is acquired. And that just gives you an idea of what was being purchased. It's a strip of land 12 to 15 feet wide. That is a War Department road. That's the War Department road. This is right around mid-1890s when that photo's from. Moving ahead, our next map, 1966, so we've had the Civil War 100th anniversary. Park Service is acquiring more land. All this dark color down here, all owned by the Park Service. This bright green is not. The orange line is the tour road. So by this point, we have the modern tour road here. The bypasses in around the bridge. So the tour road comes down from the sunken road, crosses the Boonesboro Turnpike, passes the Sherrick Farm, make the turn down to the bridge, do the loop, come back out, down Branch Avenue now. Okay. At this point, 1964, the Sherrick Farm buildings and all this land acquired by the Park Service, and just the auto buildings with a right-of-way leading to the Connecticut Monument plot. This is 1980s. The Sherrick house here, the barn is already gone, so we can take that photo. But again, showing the openness of the land in the 1980s. Park Service will make a deal and they will provide that access in the Connecticut plot. They will give that land to the farm owner in return for a scenic easement on 150 acres on the south end of the battlefield. And so that said that we're going to give you money, we're going to give you some land. In return, you're not going to construct any new features on the battlefield. And then once you decide to not be there anymore, the Park Service can then acquire the land. If we don't want to, then somebody else can, but we're the first ones that get to try and get that land. That's, long story short, a scenic easement, how that's going to work out. It is in 2003, the Park Service is able to acquire 140 acres on the south end of the battlefield that will complete all of the land down there that allows us to tell the whole story. This land includes the auto farm lane, and the auto farm lane is kind of the dividing point, the property line between the Sherricks and the autos. On the east side of the auto farm lane going to the bridge, that was all auto farm. On the west side of that is Sherrick. So Sherrick owns the lower cornfield, And he and Everett were repaid for losses. Each received money for 19 acres of corn that was lost. But at any rate, when the Park Service acquires this land in 2003, the land was not, as you can see, open anymore. The farmer that had it, he was very good at growing cedar trees. And in the trees here, a bunch of tree stands. He was essentially hunting that property. So this here, I don't know if you can tell, but this is the 16th Connecticut Monument. This is taken from the park tour road looking out towards that monument. So the park has done a lot to clean that area up. We were just having a discussion. We were supposed to have a prescribed burn this past week, but because of the rain, that did not happen. It's not going to happen next week. It's not going to happen until the spring. But that prescribed burn allows us to take that land down to get rid of the invasives and let that area grow back up. The plan at the park is to return the battlefield to the way that it appeared. We do that in a number of different ways. One of the ways is that we lease the land out. So why don't we lease the lower cornfield out? because of the terrain. It is so rough and rugged, no farmer wants to come down there and farm that piece of land. So that whole area is just going to be a warm season grass, and we're going to maintain it as that. There's a trail that you can go through, the final attack trail. We were fortunate, as a big part of being able to put that trail and figure out kind of where it goes. Same thing with the Union Advance Trail. So we've been able to open up these areas to allow you to go out and explore. And that's what you're going to be able to do tomorrow. And fortunately, for this prescribed burn that was going to happen, the park all summer has been trying to clear up some of that land to allow vehicles to get out there and so on and so forth. And so there is a wide path cut that allows you right now, you can go out there and walk in the footsteps of the 9th New York. Never been able to do that before. The photo that Jim showed earlier with Garrett up on the high ground and those swales, that is the avenue. That's right where the 9th New York walked, right through that area. Never been able to do that before. It was unbelievable to take a group out there on our anniversary weekend. In closing, I want to go back to what John said earlier. All these stories are great. And we're going out there and we're hearing the words from our guides, from Park Service folks, about what happened here, the stories of the families, what we're doing to preserve the land, to allow us to keep telling these stories. Brigades, divisions, artillery. But again, as John said, it boils down to the individual soldier. Every orientation talk I present at the battlefield, last thing I tell people is the individual stories to take home. Junior Ranger books. What's the most important thing, Mr. Ranger, to remember? The sacrifices that were made. So that said, just to illustrate that, to kind of keep you on that track as we go along this weekend, I'm sure almost everyone in the group here has looked at the official records, the after-action reports by these commanders after the battle. The Antietam volume, over 1,000 pages. But at the end of every report, almost every report, it says, see the attached casualty list. We had this many casualties, killed, wounded, so on. See the attached list. But the list isn't there. The list is stored elsewhere. In our park archive, we have the report for the 8th Connecticut. They fought in the south end of the field, up on the high ground. Report, 1 page, but they lost 194 men. And in our archive, we have the attached casualty list. I know this is hard to see, but it is 7 pages. 7 pages of names, just page after page. Soldier's name, and then the type of wound. Wounded in the body, left hand, left arm severely. Neck, calf of the leg, neck, fingers of the left hand, and so on and so forth. 7 pages of casualties. That brings it home. And just to expand on that, the quote I'll leave you with, soldiers in the 8th Connecticut, Wolcott Marsh wrote home. He said, at 9 a.m. on Friday, we were ordered to pick up the dead so that they could be buried together. I went down to where the regiment was engaged, and what a sight. 30 men from our regiment alone lay dead in a little field. Nearby were 42 Zouaves and many more from other regiments. The first man I came to was Charles Lewis, my acting orderly, then Corporal Tuck, my color corporal. And close by them lay Dwight Carey, Herbert Meade, Horace Rouse, and Mr. Sweet, all of my company. Then passing on to Company A were the bodies of Oliver Case, Orton Lord, Martin Wadhammer, and Lucius Whaler. Then on to Company K, I saw John Simmons' body, the only one whose name I could remember. We had the bodies brought down from the hill. We buried them by several of the straw stacks. As I followed back, I saw many more bodies from companies on our right. I saw Lieutenant's Waite body and Sergeant Wilcox's body, the tall, big whiskered sergeant. A little way below, I saw Harry Elmore's body of Company C. He closed by saying, I received last night your letter of Friday. Your own Wolcott. So it is those stories, it's those names of the individual soldier. Their families at home, the families whose farmsteads dot that battlefield. As you drive around it today, and you'll see. Their stories are the ones to take and share, and you remember when you go back home. It is their stories of sacrifice and suffering that took place at Antietam that you should never forget when you leave the Antietam National Battlefield. With that, thank you for sticking around this evening. Stay around and answer any questions. Thank you.